These are not manga recommendations. I've seen plenty of lists of people giving off any number of manga that you should read. This is a list of all the manga that I've dropped that I don't think were worth my time, and I don't think they'll be worth yours either. There are some caveats here later on, but for the most part, don't check these manga out. Up first is Tokyo Revengers. Pretty much everybody hates on this manga now. It is the punching bag of the manga community at this point. Not to be too hipster, but I started hating on this manga a while before the final arc, the one that everyone hates. And that's for two main reasons, really. It's a very repetitive story. In all honesty, I wish I would have stopped after the first arc. It really is the same arc over and over and over again, and I feel like it was most interesting when it was done the first time. Sure, the scope gets bigger. That doesn't necessarily mean that the story gets better. And lastly, it is still pretty cringe. This is one of the hardest to read manga in terms of just enduring the more painful moments during the series. Not painful on an emotional level like it's tugging at your heartstrings. It's just hard to read. Without a doubt, the manga I'm most petty towards is Nisekoi. For a lot of the same reasons as Tokyo Revengers, it is very repetitive. Way more so than Tokyo Revengers, actually. Really milking as many plot lines as possible before getting to that conclusion. And if you check out my any list, you'll notice that it says that I've kind of finished it. I'm on the final chapter. That's a bit of a lie while at the same time being true. Basically, I just skipped to the final chapter. I was so tired of this formula. I skipped all the way to the end, read the final chapter, and was severely disappointed. Now, this is a super personal thing. The character that won at the very end, the female that he picked, was the worst girl in the entire series. I absolutely hated her throughout the whole thing, and with her winning, that makes me hate it. I don't want my hate for this series to come off as super shallow. I just didn't like the girl that he picked. It's not the only reason. Overall, the manga just isn't good. A manga that I dropped that I don't think too many people would be surprised by is Boruto. This manga, or if you watch the anime, whichever one, it completely fumbles the bag in terms of the Naruto conclusion. I think that Naruto had one of the most satisfying conclusions, and it completely botched it with this sequel. That's not a hot take by any means, but still, it is how I feel. But that's not to say I didn't give Boruto a chance. I'm really not that far behind anyway, mostly because this is a monthly manga. So even if you don't read it for a year, you're only 12 chapters behind. And I do think that's part of the problem. This story can never really build up any steam because it's monthly, releasing the page count of a weekly manga. Because the thing is, with most monthly manga, the page count is a bit higher, probably 30-40 pages compared to, the 15-20 pages that are usually in a weekly shonen manga. So that output just is not there for Boruto. And then on top of that, I don't feel like the moments that do actually happen are really all that worth it anyways. To me, there is no hype in this series. I see some people get really hyped about Jigen, Naruto's new form, stuff like that. None of it worked for me. Naruto's form, it sucked. It was ugly from a design perspective. It was a complete Deus Ex Machina and ass pull narratively, and I don't really think it came with any cool or unique abilities that made it stand out against the rest of his forms. And then Jigen is just a terrible antagonist. All he had going for him was presence, and even then, I don't feel like he had much more presence than even some of the lesser villains in Naruto. Still, to the last chapter that I read, Momoshiki has always been the best antagonist in the series, and even then, that's not saying much. I also don't agree with the characterization of our classic Naruto characters like Naruto and Sasuke. Just to put things blatantly, them being absent parents makes no sense given their history. This is a trope that gets used a lot with a lot of these very big characters that, had a rough childhood. Harry Potter, he turned out to be kind of an absentee father, and it made as little sense with him as it does with Naruto and Sasuke. Lastly, nobody's going to know this manga. It's called Ichigeki. Basically, I was looking for samurai manga to read, and this is one of the ones that got recommended. It's only 47 chapters, I believe, and I still couldn't finish it. It was insanely boring, and I just found the art to be pretty unpleasant to look at. Like, I just thought it was kind of ugly. Sounds mean, mean, but that is genuinely the only thoughts I had on the series. Next up is a manga that I don't think were worth my time, but a lot of people do like, so it might just be something that's not for me. First up is Golden Kamuy. Now, this manga, it is quality. Like, this is something I can see pretty clearly, but it does have a pretty major flaw. I think it does a poor job of meshing the action, mystery, comedy, and cooking aspects of the series. It completely destroys the pacing. It is a very hard manga to follow just in that aspect, because you'll be super invested into the action or the mystery, and then you'll get multiple chapters of just comedy and cooking, and that just didn't really work for me at all. But like I said, this is probably a personal thing. It is very long manga with a pretty substantial fan base, and whenever I did get invested into the story, I did enjoy it, but I'm just not going to deal with that tug of war of these core concepts to this story. House Husband is also something that I read at least a little bit of before deciding not really to pick it up again. This one isn't bad by any means. I think it's very funny, and I think the art is genuinely very good, but obviously the big problem here is that this story is insanely repetitive. He is a Yakuza being a house husband, and that's the whole thing. That's the gimmick. So the creative part is finding new ways to make that gimmick continuously funny or interesting, and eventually I just lost interest. I like this manga for what it was. There just really wasn't a point, at least to me, in keeping up with this series. Now, what's going to be the hottest take on here is To Your Eternity. This is a series a lot of people have really come to love, and I can definitely see why. In fact, I started to get really into the series so much that I started collecting the physicals for it, and for the first 3 arcs, I really did enjoy this series. But as the story continued to go on, I started to notice some things that really started to bother me. Really, I didn't sit well with it, and it started to become super predictable and, as I've said a couple of times on here, very repetitive. I think the author was very blatantly setting a lot of cry-bait, really trying to get you invested emotionally, and then kind of tugging at that string. I think for the early arcs, this worked really well, but as the series gets longer, you kind of have to work harder to, lay these plot lines. I just feel like it never really had that same cleverness that it had in the beginning. Plus, there is a section, and I think it's the 4th or 5th arc, but one of the characters we followed early on that obviously wasn't our protagonist, but one of the side characters, they end up getting murdered off screen, and we kind of find out by our main character getting her abilities. And that entire moment, for those who have read it know what I'm talking about, but that does not work for me at all. I thought it was insanely stupid, and it was one of the breaking points for me that made me drop this manga. But more so than anything else, it's the fact it just became super predictable with what was going on. It could get better, but I would have no idea. Now, some might call this one cheating because it's Tower of God, and technically I guess you could say this one's on hold. I do plan on picking it back up eventually, but it's probably been on hold for years now. A whole 1 or 2 years on hold, and then I just put it in the drop section until I pick it up again. But I've read a lot of this manga, and for a while now, I just haven't had any interest in picking it back up. There are some great aspects to it, obviously, for how long I've read it. The progression of the author is absolutely insane. Let's just say his early work wasn't the most impressive, but he has gotten to the point where I think he has some of the most impressive and impactful manhwa panels. But that's pretty much where the progression stops, because the character growth is pretty much non-existent for most of the cast. Bam does have one of his biggest moments and whatnot, but aside from his huge moment with, a character that he is very close to, something that he needed to overcome that people were really anticipating, aside from that, this manhwa completely drops the ball, even when it comes to Bam, but more so with the side characters. They are completely stagnant for the entire story pretty much. So while there is a lack of growth, there is also a lack of good antagonists. There are characters that are potentially really good antagonists, like we have characters like White, Caliban, those types of characters, but they never stay antagonists for like the entirety of an arc or anything. White pretty much joins the side of our main characters for a long while, and then where I left off, Caliban had gotten recruited on their side as well. I'm not saying that they don't get betrayed in the future, but the antagonists do not stay antagonists for whatever reason. Lastly is a manga named Oku, another one of these samurai manga that I wanted to pick up. Now, it's pretty weird. It's kind of like a last man story where there's a disease that spreads across all of Japan and it kills off most of the men. So now it's very much a matriarch where the whole land is ruled by women, basically. And so men's role in society is then shifted. It is not at all what I thought this manga was going to be, and it very much focuses on that other side of being samurai. There is the fighting aspect that most Westerners focus on, and it's pretty much what anybody thinks of when they think of a samurai. And then there's the more penmanship, the more artistic side of everything. They are politicians, a lot of them anyways, after all. But this is an anthology series, so you follow this concept through multiple different perspectives and multiple different storylines that take place at different times in this universe's history. And I only ever read the first story arc, and it was really good. Like, I have absolutely very few complaints. I don't want to say no complaints, but I have very few. Genuinely a very good story. But after that, I completely lost any interest. I was not invested in these later stories because I felt like everything got wrapped up so nicely after that first story. I attempted to go further, but I just really couldn't. The next category is the Shonen Jump graveyard. I noticed a trend going through my dropped manga, and a lot of these were just series that I was keeping up with, and then they got canceled. Keeping up with being a bit loose, obviously I fell behind because they're not completed. I dropped them. But up first is the manga Ashaimon. This is one of the more recent, probably the most recently canceled series on this list, and it was really just fine. I can't really complain about it too much. I was interested in where the story was going, and mostly because of the author, him being the author of Hell's Paradise, I was actually interested in his works. But this manga didn't really have anything special about it. It really just felt like a manga, but this time written by somebody whose work I'd previously liked. Phantom Seer, on the other hand, was amazing. Like, I genuinely really loved reading this week to week. I don't even know why I fell behind. I think I wanted to build up chapters or something like that, but the story had a ton of potential. I was very interested in seeing where things went next, and the artwork was beautiful. Just a very nice to look at series. And I don't know the sales numbers. That's probably why it got canceled, but I'm genuinely surprised this series did not do better. Black Torch is another one of these manga that a lot of people really, at least in the West anyways, really came to like. Me, not so much. It did feel very samey to a lot of classic shonen. Unlike those classic shonen, this one really just seemed to lack any sort of depth. Like, there was nothing about these archetypes or this story that I really found interesting. It's like the author was checking off a to-do list, for all these different elements that these popular classic shonen have, but not really expanding upon that in an interesting way at all. But I will say it had great art. Like, I genuinely really liked the art. And sure, I guess given its concept, it did have some potential. And then there's Samurai 8, which I've already talked about. I made a full video on why this manga failed. I'll link it below. But kind of encapsulating everything in a pretty short segment, it tried to really rush into being complex without setting the groundwork. It tried to build this complex power system with this very detailed world, and those kind of just existed on their own without anything interesting to help prop them up, and that just does not work. Funnily enough, the most interesting character, despite of course the reputation of Kishimoto as writing poorly written female characters, the best character in the series was the main female character. The protagonist was lacking, his sensei was kind of interesting, and all the side characters are completely forgettable. I do remember there being a Sasuke copy, at least when it comes to his design later on in the series, but I can't really remember anything else about him. But I do think with this series, Kishimoto should have done something very similar to what Tite Kubo did with Burn the Witch and Bleach. He should have just taken his time, done the art and the story himself, and just released it whenever he was ready. Obviously, I don't know if Shonen Jump would have even been cool with that, but it would have definitely worked out better than this manga did. And lastly is Bone Collection. I'm really surprised I read as much of this as I did. I must have been really bored. I think it was kind of pervy too. I could be wrong there, but just a very bad combination. I did read over 10 chapters, I think, and I have no idea why I read that much. These last couple ones are completely on me. This category is called I Fell Off. First up is Go-Go Loser Ranger. I was actually reading this at the same time I was rewatching Power Rangers Dino Thunder, and that's kind of what really got me into this series. That and a Broken Ronin video, but it kind of really hit all the notes I really wanted in a series like this. It had great art, it was a really fun concept, but I just stopped reading it when I was done with Dino Thunder. I should definitely get back into it, but I just haven't really wanted to yet. Dr. Stone, I'm actually super disappointed I dropped this one because, I started this very early on. First 5 chapters that came out, I was on it basically the day of release, and I really did love it and everything about it. I was on that Boichi hype train because I'd read Sun Can Rock. The characters were interesting, especially the main character. The art, obviously, since it's Boichi, it looked amazing, and the story, its concepts, a lot of the arcs that I followed, I just found all of it to be super interesting. But I think at the time I had just been feeling some manga burnout, so I just stopped reading for a long time. And then as the chapters built up, whenever I did get back into manga, there were too many chapters that I just didn't really feel like catching up on. And then lastly is Right on King. This is a very funny manga, and it's one of the first manga I made like an actual manga recommendations video on. Tropey, very gimmicky, and it had some insane art. Really, this manga was just hitting for me at the time, especially because I wanted something to kind of diversify what I was reading, and this really did that job perfectly. But whenever I read it, there was like 10 chapters out, maybe. I think it was even less. It might have been like 5 to 10. Basically, there was just a very low number of chapters out at the time. This is a monthly manga, so eventually I just fell behind. I know that there's not that many chapters I have to read, but I just haven't really made the time to catch up on this series. So I'll keep it in the drop section until I actually take that time to catch up. But yeah, that's my entire dropped list. These are all the manga I've dropped. But tell me what you guys thought. Have you dropped some of these manga? Are these some of your favorite manga? Have you even heard of some of these? But with all that being said, I'm